So that we have gone through validating the scope as the first key process group when dealing with the project constraints as part of the monitoring and controlling process group. I want now to, let's say, to proceed with the next, let's say, key process, which is controlling the scope. And just to differentiate between validating the scope and controlling the scope, I would say that validating the scope can comes at the end of this monitoring and controlling process group because it gathers every key of these processes and then it validates that each of these deliverables meet all of the, let's say, the schedule, the cost, the quality, the resources. As you can think of, the validating the scope can come at the end of this monitoring and controlling process, and controlling the scope can be the start of a monitoring and controlling process. So let's now understand the differentiation again between the validating and controlling the scope. So understanding the let's say first scope control. But what exactly scope control is? Scope control is a crucial part of project management that ensures that the project remains aligned with the approved scope. And without a proper scope control, projects can suffer from scope creep, where we have talked about the uncontrolled changes without following, let's say, a formal change control process where it could impact the project constraints, also delays and cost overruns. And this process involves continuously monitoring deliverables. Monitoring the deliverables are different from validating these deliverables. So that's why I talked about validating the scope at the beginning. So monitoring the deliverables and managing changes throughout, let's say, through a formal change control process and using the variance analysis to track the deviations. To summarize the scope control, we say is that it ensures the project remains with the defined objectives and it prevents the unauthorized scope changes or known as the scope creep, and it uses the formal change control for the approvals. The code performance is measured through a variance analysis and baselining. Now let's understand more in depth what exactly is scope creep. So scope creep is one of the most significant risks in project execution. It occurs when an additional feature or requirements are added without a structured change approval process. And this often happens due to poorly defined requirements or changing stakeholder expectation and not following a structured change process or change control process. Preventing scope creep requires a strict requirements documentation, stakeholder alignment, and strong change management policies. The scope creep causes the budget overruns and missed deadlines. And the common causes we've talked about here, and we talked when we were validating the scope, we talked about the unclear requirements, stakeholder pressure, and poor change control, let's say, poor change control process. Change control process and scope management. So the change control process ensures that the let's say any of these requested changes to the project scope are evaluated for its visibility, evaluated and assessed for its visibility, impact, and necessity before approval. It involves submitting a formal change request, conducting an impact analysis, and obtaining the approvals from the change control board, which is known as the CCB. So again, to understand this in more in depth and to understand it more in scope management or planning the scope management and what is the relation between the change control process and scope management. So we say that change control board, it they are the authority or they are the team who reviews and approves the scope changes, and the change requests should be assessed based on their impact, schedule, and risks, and overall project constraints. and that change request will be evaluated by the change control board. If the changes are approved, can be considered as a formally documented and updated on the scope baseline. To understand the scope baseline with its role in terms of scope control, and if you recall where we have established the scope baseline, and if you recall what was the scope baseline is, if you recall when we were gathering the requirements, we have, let's say, completed collecting the requirements and we established a scope baseline where all of the deliverables are listed based on the collected deliverables. So we've said that this are the deliverables that we are going to deliver, and that's all. So this is called the scope baseline, where it's initiated at the planning phase. And the scope control now, where at the monitoring and controlling process group, so you have to compare whatever changes kind of or compared to the scope baseline where it was defined early in the project. Scope baseline is a critical document in scope control. It acts like as a benchmark, measure the scope performance against the actual progress. Remember the scope baseline when we talked about saying that it consists of the project scope statement, the WBS or the work breakdown structure, and the WBS dictionary, where it contains all of the activities, details, and assignee to each of these activities in the WBS. The WBS, when we talked about it, it's used as a reference for measuring the scope performance, and it gets updated only when there's an approved changes occur. The WBS and WBS dictionary is very critical document because it serves as the key baseline to the scope, including the project scope statement. So again, if there is any deviation of between, let's say, the scope baseline when controlling the scope, the corrective actions can be taken here to realign the project back to its original objectives. Variance analysis and scope control as one of these key tools and techniques that can be used to help you understanding, let's say, the variance, to understand the deviation from the planned scope, the differences between the planned scope compared to the existing scope, and it helps you to determine in case if there's any corrective action like submitting a change request or rebaselining is required to ensure that your project is running without any delays. And it mainly used to compare conducting a variance analysis is mainly done, to conduct or to compare the planned versus the actual scope performance. The variance analysis here is used to, again, to helps the project manager to determine whether the changes are needed to be made or if any corrective actions are necessary to be taken. Remember that large variances may require a scope rebaselining. Let's take an example here. For example, let's say when building a mobile application project, which is planned to develop an application with basic e-commerce functionality. Halfway through, let's say one of these stakeholders requested an additional AI-driven personalization feature, causing the scope variance. The project team conducts a variance analysis and determine that the change request is needed. Based on that, they will take the corrective action by submitting change request to readjust the baseline and to include the stakeholder, let's say, additional requirements. Let's now look into how to manage the scope changes proactively. So scope changes are can be avoided, let's say, but they must be managed proactively. Ensure you as a project manager to establish a clear scope dictation at the beginning and keeping the stakeholder engaged, which reduces the unnecessary changes. So ensure to define a clear scope requirements upfront. Also keep engaging the stakeholders to set a realistic expectation. You cannot just collect any requirements and without understanding these requirements, and then you be surprised with the ability or the cost or the time of implementing these capabilities. So ensures that the stakeholders have a realistic expectation to avoid over promising these stakeholders. The last important point here we have to manage the scope changes proactively is we said many times that you need to have a formal change control procedures to evaluate the modification and to ensure that all of these changes are documented. Let's look now here into an important concepts again. Compare the comparison between the scope verification versus the scope validation. Scope verification ensures that the project deliverables meet the predefined requirements. Okay, again, scope verification or validation, it ensures that the project deliverables meet the predefined requirements. While scope validation, no, first we've talked about scope verification to verify whether the project deliverables meet the predefined requirements. Now, again, let's talk about the scope validation. So, the scope validation is a formal acceptance of all of these deliverables by the stakeholders. If there is an issue arise, a corrective actions are taken to align the project with the expectations. Again, to summarize the main difference between the scope verification versus the scope validation. Scope verification ensures all the work meets the specification. On the other hand, the scope validation, it's like obtaining the formal acceptance of all of the deliverables by the stakeholders. Now let's see the role of WBS or work breakdown structure in scope control, which is a very important vital role here. The work breakdown structure or the WBS is a powerful tool in scope control. By breaking, let's say, the project into a smaller work packages, it provides a clarity on the, let's say, the project deliverables, responsibilities, and dependencies. And if any scope changes occur, WBS help you assess their impact in terms of dependency, terms of responsibility of the other teams as well. And it's used to define what is included in the scope and what is not. So I think as the WBS or the work breakdown structure is a very important document where it tells you what is included in the scope and what is not. Now let's look into the way of how you control the scope in Agile project management. So Agile projects embrace the flexibility and enhances the flexibility and weight to have a dynamic flexibility in scope through conducting an iterations. Unlike the traditional project, so Agile project uses the incremental development to accommodate the changes dynamically. Instead of a formal change requests, the traditional project management, Agile teams manage the scope using a backlog and sprint planning and prioritization techniques, which we are going to cover deeply when we start talking about Agile section. And we talked about these frameworks and methodologies. One of these frameworks, very important, famous framework, which is called Scrum, where it has all of these backlog of refinement sessions, the sprint planning, sprint reviews, the sprint retrospectives, and prioritization technique to, let's say, to sort all of these requirements in terms of their value, in terms of their risks. So again, we when we talked about how to have a scope control in agile project management, we said that agile projects have a flexibility in scope throughout or through the conducting iterations or sprints. Scope control is achieved using a backlog, product backlog refinement and sprint planning, and any changes are managed through the prioritization techniques, and there is no formal change control boards are required when handling an agile project. And let's take here a quick example. For example, there's in case if a project manager is running a project in Agile methodology for to develop a software development. Let's say there's a new feature request which was requested by one of these key stakeholders or client, which can just be added into the product backlog and will be prioritized based on the business value and risk. Think of this in case if this was a traditional or waterfall project. Instead of requiring a formal change request, the feature here in Agile is planned into, let's say, upcoming sprint if the requirements have, let's say, achieved a higher prioritization. Summarize our, let's say, session on scope control as part of the monitoring and controlling process group. We say that scope control is essential process to keep the project aligned with the business objective. It involves managing the changes and using variance analysis and ensuring the stakeholders formally accept deliverables. Without scope control, the project risks the cost overruns, delays, and misalignment with the business needs.